Cool. So I'm going to be doing a talk about reimagining gofmt for Go 2.0, and that's a slightly clickbaity title. But I want to begin with, how do you guys pronounce gofmt? Who says gofmt? Raise your hands. Who says go format? Who says gofmt? Okay. Okay. So about half of you are not allowed to write Go code, at least as far as some people would say. Okay. So we're going to begin with, do you guys think this piece of code is properly formatted Go code? No. In Go, no. The answer is no. You're fired. So the answer is, if you run gofmt on that piece of code, or go format, or gofmt, you're going to get it rewritten. So how did we get here? These first slides are based on Robert Grismer's slides from 2015, which go into more detail as to how gofmt started. So you can just read those later if you want to get into more details. But to get the basics, in 2007, when they started thinking about Go and code formatting, the state of the world in code formatting was weird. Some people formatted with IDEs, but some people don't use IDEs. And then the people that do use IDEs use different ones, and they behave differently, correct? And some use pretty printers, such as the ones you have for JavaScript, but they tend to have hundreds of options, so it's not like everybody uses the same formatting. And at the end of the day, formatting doesn't matter. What matters is consistency, and most importantly, readability. As long as we can all agree on a format that's readable, and then we all use it consistently, then we just forget about formatting completely. So gofmt was planned from day one for Go, and it was actually released as part of the initial Go open source release, I believe. And that was the plan, waste zero time and all this stuff. And they wanted to keep the implementation as simple as possible. So they said, we don't want this to be 1,000 lines of super complex code that has super complex heuristics. We want it to be really simple. And it should be really easy to use. And a big part of that is no options. It does have a few flags, but none of them control how the code is actually formatted. So one decision that they took, which is a little bit controversial, is that it doesn't try to control line length, at least not completely, and it mostly respects the user's line breaks. So if you choose to do a lot in a single line, it's probably going to let it sit there, and if you choose to add lots of new lines, it's probably going to let you do that, and emphasis on probably. So if you want to play with how gofmt works internally, it uses a package called go/ast. And there's this site that Paul Jolly wrote. You could see him before in yellow there. So if the site doesn't work, you can just go to him and ask. So this site is really cool. I'm not going to show it here because I don't want to spend the time. But it lets you write Go code and see the syntax tree as it's being parsed and built on the right-hand side. And I think that's really cool. And you can sort of visually see what happens under the hood. So parsing is going from the Go plaintext into the syntax tree. It uses a package called Go Scanner, which is a tokenizer, a lexer, and then a parser, which actually builds the syntax tree. And then it can go the other way around. It can go from this syntax tree back into plaintext with either the printer package, which is the actual package that implements a printer, and then Go format is just a thin wrapper over Go printer that implements the exact formatting options that you get with gofmt. So let's take a quick test. We've done some theory. Who thinks this piece of code is properly formatted Go code? Please raise your hands. I see some people going like, So it is properly formatted Go code. You're allowed to set up arguments in separate lines, and trailing commas in these cases are allowed, I think in all cases, but they're required. Can't hear you, what?
They are mandatory in this case?
Yeah, so in this case, if there's a new line before the closing parenthesis, you do need to add the trailing new line. So it's like lists, like composite literals. What about this one? Who thinks it's validly formatted Go code? Oh, I'm always going to say yes. I'm just encouraging you guys. Sometimes I'm going to encourage you to fail. That's up to you to decide. OK, so that's about a quarter of the people. This is not correct code. So The reason here is a little bit contrived. So some pretty printers would actually double indent that body. But in this case, if you think about it, you open the binary expression, foo and bar, and then bar gets indented. But this binary expression finishes. So you de-indent and then indent again when you begin the block. So you don't see it here, but if you could have the opening brace on a separate line, it wouldn't be indented. So that's the reason why there's no double indent. What about this one? Who thinks it's validly formatted Go code? Cool, so about half the people, this one is correct. It is valid Go code. You're allowed to have one empty line practically anywhere, as long as it's not more than one empty line, I think. What about this one? Who thinks it's valid Go code? I only see like a dozen brave people. And those brave people are actually correct. This is validly formatted Go code. And I think this shouldn't be, but it is. That's how life is. Last example, and it's a triple example. You've got 3 functions that are all on their single unique lines. And the first one only has 1 statement. The second one has 2 statements. And the third one has what you would call 1 complex statement. So who thinks all of them are validly formatted Go code? OK, I'm not going to do each of the combinations, because I don't want to. I'm too lazy for that. So the answer here is that the last one is going to be changed. The other ones are not. The reason the last one is changed is because if statements are not allowed to take a single line, so by extension, then the function cannot be single line. And in the other cases, if the functions were longer, then they would be split into multiple lines. But there's some heuristic that says if the function can be printed in few enough columns, then it's allowed to be on a single line. So it does limit line length under some very specific circumstances, but I think this is acceptable. So you might be saying, what is going on? I use gofmt, but I never realized that some of these things were so weird, right? And gofmt does have some extra features, such as it has a flag to do some rewrites. And it also has a flag to simplify code, which is going to do things like remove redundant type names. And the reception when gofmt started back in 2009 and 10 was a success. Nowadays, everybody follows it, correct? And that has multiple advantages. Besides everybody writing code that looks the same and reads the same, it enables extra tools like Go imports, so you never have to think about adding or removing imports yourself. And the tool can rewrite your entire source code without messing up your formatting, because you're using that same formatting. And the same goes for other tools like GoFix and GoGenerate. So the result is that Go kind of led by example in this case. And you can see formatters these days like Rust FMT and Dart FMT. I don't know if they call it Dart FMT. That would be quite interesting. But there's a trend lately of using unified formats, especially with new languages like Go. So what's the catch? Up until now, I've showed you that gofmt works. I've showed you that it's a little bit quirky, but what's the catch here? The catch is that gofmt was designed over a decade ago now. And a few mistakes were made, obviously. These people are way better coders than me and you, but they still make mistakes. One of the biggest mistakes is that comments in the syntax tree are free-floating. What that means is that they're not attached to specific nodes. They're just like floating by position. And modifying code messes them up. And I've got a simple example here. Suppose that you've got 2 imports, foo and bar, and you want to sort them alphabetically. So you want bar to go before foo. And then bar has a comment. So if you try to rewrite this piece of code by just swapping the imports, most likely what's going to happen is that the comment is going to stay in its place. And that's wrong, because now you've got a comment for bar next to foo. The reason is because when you look at a simplified view of the file in this case, you see that the declarations, that should say imports. When you see the imports, they're completely separate from the comments. And the only thing that tells you the comment is attached to bar is its position, because it's right after the position of the bar import. So if you swap them, essentially what's going to happen is you're going to print bar and foo, and only later is the position of the comment going to come into play. So this is kind of difficult to work with. And it is probably going to get fixed at some point in the future, but gofmt these days is locked into this limitation. So GoParser and GoAST are a little bit weird. And a big part of this reason, besides being old, is that what we know now as idiomatic Go code wasn't invented back then. Idiomatic Go code maybe appeared in 2010, 11, 12 or so. And this was written many years before. So for example, if you want to parse one file, you can do parser.parsefile. So far, so good. You can parse one expression as well, which is very common. But what if you want to parse one statement or one declaration, such as a function declaration, or just one type, like a map from string to int? You cannot do those things easily. You can template a file and then fill in the blank with the source, and that might work. But if it errors, it's going to give a very confusing error because it also contains the rest of the source code. So that's kind of difficult to do. Positions are also, I think, kind of a pain in the ass. And I should probably not use those words. But basically, when you get a position, it's like an internal offset into what they call a file set. And this is not usable to the user. It makes sense internally, but if you actually want to get the information, like what file is this, what line is this, what column is this, you have to grab the file set and ask it, what's the actual position of this? And then you get that information. So it's kind of a little bit pointless to go back and forth like this. And here's the personal take and kind of the basis of this talk, which is that gofmt doesn't go far enough. So for example, here we've got a little monstrosity of a piece of code. And this is actually valid gofmt. So this is validly formatted Go code. And the reason is because you can have a new line at the beginning of your parameter list. You can have a new line in the middle of an expression. You can have empty lines anywhere you want, and so on. And I could actually add more new lines here, but I couldn't fit it into the slide. So I personally think this piece of code should not be valid gofmt, because nobody would ever write this as quote unquote idiomatic Go code, or at least as far as formatting goes. So I've come up with a few rules that I try to apply when I review code. I'm going to give some examples now. One is no empty lines at the beginning or end of function declarations, which I think is fair. I can't think of any case where one would want those. Another case is if you've got a block with a single statement, no empty lines around that statement, and we're assuming that there are no comments either before or after. Another case is if you have a simple error check, which means that you declare an error somehow, and then check it with a simple if error not equals nil, which happens very often in Go, you should not have an empty line in between those two. And I've seen some people do that, and it annoys me so much that I've made it my life mission to delete all of those empty lines. Another one is what I think fairly nice, which is that if there are any empty lines between two elements in a list, such as a composite literal, there should also be empty lines at the beginning and end of that list. So it makes it much nicer to read. Another one, which I'm not so sure about, is if you've got a switch case and it can fit into quote unquote a short line, and I'm not going to define what that is because I don't want to start a style war. If it fits into one short line, and again there are no comments, then it should be on a single line. And another one which might be a little bit controversial is if you're declaring multiple things at once with parentheses, but you're actually only declaring one thing, you shouldn't use the parentheses. And I know that you might say, oh, but what if I want to add another import? I would have to re-add those parentheses myself. And the answer is no, because you would be using Go imports. So if you're trying to do that manually, you're wrong. And finally, I believe that you should never use the var way to declare a variable if you're just using name equals value, because using colon equals is just shorter and more consistent. So I also try to enforce that, but obviously not if you're, for example, if you don't have a type, if you don't have a value, or if you do have a type, because you can only do those things with var. So you might be wondering to yourself, I want to apply all of those things to my code, or I want to enforce them when developers send me code that doesn't feel Go-like. but I don't want to fall asleep just reading through the entire code and just enforcing it manually. So in other words, how do we automate this? So we cannot really change gofmt in this way because it's a very slow-moving piece of software. And the reason is because practically everybody uses it. So it does get fixes and some new features, but largely it's feature frozen. So the answer is just fork it, right? So that's not a pun, by the way. I basically took the entire gofmt code base and I just made some changes to it. It's still BSD licensed because it's mainly just a copy and paste. And it's a drop-in replacement for gofmt. And it does most of the things that I talked about earlier and some other things which I didn't get into. It also has a gofmt ports for Go imports. And it's a playground to experiment. I would like to think that at some point, the good bits would get upstreamed into gofmt. So somebody would say, hey, I no longer use gofmt, now I use gofmt, and confuse everybody. So the parting thought here would be that you've got a very large set of Go programs that compile. And you could say this is a never-ending set, but let's think about realistic Go programs. And I've got some transitions here, so let's see if I didn't mess this up. Ooh, it works. So, and then within that set of software that parses and compiles, we've got a set of software that is valid gofmt. But then we've got a much, much smaller set of software, which is what you would call idiomatic Go code as far as formatting goes. But there's a big gap between what gofmt accepts and what people would, good Go developers would write, correct? So ideally, I would think that gofmt, as in the old one, could move here, move to this red line at some point. Until then, we've got gofmt to fight gofmt. But I personally don't see it as a fight. As I said, it's just a grounds to experiment and to see what works, and then propose to upstream those good bits back into gofmt. And now that I'm pronouncing everything the same way, it's confusing, isn't it? So that's the end of it. Any questions? I think we've got plenty of time. I don't know how questions are going to work.
I'll run with the mic.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I learned a lot, that's for sure. I'm really a fan of this fork because I thought about it as well. Essentially, I'm a bit frustrated on Go imports and gofmt for a certain reason. Essentially, as an open source project maintainer, I cannot ensure that the code on the PR was formatted. This is because the gofmt has kind of, you cannot assure the certain formatting because it changed over the Go version, which is super frustrating. You cannot pin Go imports or gofmt because essentially it pins, it goes with the Go version, the code itself is there. So like having a fork of it, like maybe fix that, maybe not, what do you think? Is it fixable, essentially? I want essentially to have gofmt or Go imports being independent of Go version.
I actually had a very similar discussion with Robert a couple of years ago, and the Go team's answer was basically, you need to decide which gofmt version you want to use. So if you say we enforce gofmt 111, then you have to tell everybody use that version. Now that's the part that's actually complicated because some people are going to be on 112. There's going to be one person on Go 110.0 for sure. So there was a proposal that I filed last year, but I never got around to implementing it, which is basically offering Go gettable versions of gofmt. So you would do go get, I think they decided on golang.org/cmd/version/gofmt or something like that. And then they would just be like little wrappers around the actual code from that Go version. Maybe that would be useful. Honestly, I never needed it bad enough to actually implement it. If the tool lives outside of the Go repo, then it is a little bit easier to pin it down with tools, maybe. It's up to what feels comfortable to you. But definitely you should enforce a single version and tell people to use that.
Any other questions?
Thanks again for the talk, Brett. A question more stylistic in this case. In some examples, it looks to me that you even are still not going far enough. So just an opinion in this case. So it's about the formatting specifically of function parameters. It's the usual thing. Personally, I know quite a lot of developers who try to enforce it manually and reuse. It's one of the, you said the real battle was to do some piece of formatting. Doesn't like that, or formatting is either you put all your line for Java on a single line, or you put one per line. Did you implement something like on simple strokes, by the way, declarations? Did you do something like that in gofmt?
Which gofmt are you talking about?
112?
So I haven't implemented anything like that yet. The only thing that's close is the thing where it requires new lines at the beginning and end. Are there any new lines in between elements? Somebody opened an issue about, if somebody fits way too many key values in a single line, that should be split into one key value per line. I kind of agree, but the question then is, what's the heuristic here? Should it be the number of bytes? The number of characters in that expression? Should it be the number of characters for the entire line? Should it be the number of key value expressions within that expression? I'm not sure. I'm probably going to come up with something that seems okay and see if people are angry or not. Usually you only get users yelling at you when they're angry, not when they're happy. So I will probably go for something that's a little bit aggressive, see if it sticks, and then go from there.
Any other questions? I think we're done. And quite unbelievably, we're early as well. So Daniel, thank you very much indeed.